I want to begin by telling you about something that appeared in last week's Wall Street Journal, an article by Michael Oren and Mark Gerson, and they wrote about Jonah's dilemma. In the book of Jonah, God commands Jonah, his prophet, to go to Nineveh, and the great city, and cry against it. Jonah's task seems relatively straightforward. Either the people of Nineveh listen to him and repent for their sins, or they ignore him and they receive God's divine destruction. Yet Jonah balks at these instructions directly from God, first to the sea and then to the desert. His task may have seemed straightforward at the beginning, but after he thought about it for a while, it may not have been so straightforward after all. If Nineveh ignores Jonah's instructions and his exhortations and is destroyed, then he has failed as a prophet. Think of Winston Churchill and his exhortations in the 1930s, his prophetic warnings, if you will, of the Nazi threat. His prophetic warnings were ignored at the time. However, if he had convinced his countrymen to strike Germany preemptively, would he have been hailed for preventing World War II, or would he have been condemned for an unnecessary conflict? Now, on the other hand, consider Jonah's dilemma from another point of view. If Nineveh heeds Jonah's warning and is spared, its citizens will later question whether the city really ever was in danger and assailing him for forcing them to make the sacrifices that he requested of them. Think of George Bush warning that the United States would be attacked again after 9/11 unless it acted preemptively in Iraq. We would have no way of knowing, we still have no way and never will have any way of knowing, if America would have been attacked if Bush's prophetic message was not heeded. And he is now, of course, being assailed for initiating perhaps an avoidable war. So, either way, poor Jonah loses. Or to put it another way, predictions are very difficult to make, especially about the future. Although the prophetic age has already passed, we are fortunate to have with us tonight a brave soul who will prophesy about our medical future as he addresses the issue of the more perfect human, the promise and perils of modern medicine. Leon R. Kass is the Addie Clark Harding Professor in the Committee on Social Thought and the College at the University of Chicago and Hertog Fellow in Social Thought at the American Enterprise Institute. A native of Chicago, Dr. Kass was educated at the University of Chicago, where he earned his BS and his MD degrees, and at Harvard, where he received his Ph.D. in biochemistry. After doing work in molecular biology at the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Kass shifted directions from doing science to thinking about its human meaning. He has been engaged for over 35 years with ethical and philosophical issues raised by biomedical advance, and more recently, with broader moral and cultural issues. Dr. Kass has held academic appointments at St. John's College, Georgetown University, and since 1976 at the University of Chicago. And he has also held many important government appointments. For example, from 1970 to 1972, he served as Executive Secretary of the Committee on the Life Sciences and Social Policy of the National Research Council and National Academy of Sciences, whose report, Assessing Biomedical Technologies, provided one of the first overviews of the emerging moral and social questions posed by biomedical advances. From 2001 to 2005, Dr. Kass served 2 terms as the first chairman of the President's Council on Bioethics. Under his leadership, the Council published 6 major books and a white paper on topics ranging from human cloning and human dignity to ethical caregiving in our aging society. And I can tell you that I often refer to these publications for source material because they're just outstanding publications. His own books include Toward a More Natural Science, Biology and Human Affairs, The Hungry Soul, Eating and the Perfecting of Our Nature, The Ethics of Human Cloning with James Q. Wilson, Wing to Wing, Oar to Oar, Readings on Courting and Marrying with Amy Kass, his wife of 46 years and the mother and grandmother of their 2 daughters and 4 granddaughters, Life, Liberty, and the Defense of Dignity, and last but not least, The Beginning of Wisdom, Reading Genesis. For all of these accomplishments and many more which I do not have time to mention, Dr. Kass was named one of the first 4 inaugural recipients of the Distinguished Bradley Prize in 2003. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Leon Kass to Holocaust Museum Houston.
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction, and thank you all for being here and being out in the network. It is an honor and a privilege to be invited to speak in this most important series of lectures on medical ethics and the Holocaust, and also to be able to experience the remarkable exhibits in this remarkable museum. It is also for me a humbling and rather daunting task, one which I approach with fear and trembling. For what we witness here is, in my opinion, best observed and honored by reverent but anguished silence, and it is imperiled by easygoing speech. On the other hand, as the living witnesses to the atrocities increasingly pass from the scene, we need to strain every nerve and use all of our powers to ensure that the world will never forget and will never see its like again. This exhibit and this series of lectures is a wonderful contribution to those goals, and I present this talk as a modest contribution toward achieving this goal. As nearly everyone appreciates, we live near the beginning of the golden age of biomedical science and technology. For the most part, we should be mightily glad that we do. We and our friends and loved ones are many times over the beneficiaries of its cures for diseases, prolongation of life, and amelioration of suffering, psychic and somatic. Since the latter third of the last century, most human beings living in technologically advanced countries have been living healthier and longer lives than even the most fortunate individuals in prior human history. Diphtheria, typhoid, and tuberculosis threaten us no longer. Despite the lack of a definitive cure, half the people who are today treated for deadly cancers survive more than 5 years. The average American's life expectancy at birth has increased from 47 in 1900 to 78 and climbing in 2000. And millions are now living healthily into their 80s and 90s. Thanks to basic research in neuroscience and new psychotropic drugs, the scourge of major depression and other devastating mental illnesses are finally under effective attack. We have every reason to look forward eagerly to new discoveries and new medical blessings. Every one of us should be deeply grateful for the gifts of human ingenuity and for the devoted efforts of scientists, physicians, and entrepreneurs who have used these gifts to make those benefits possible. Yet notwithstanding these blessings, present and projected, we have also seen more than enough to make us concerned. For we recognize that the powers made possible by biomedical science can be used for non-therapeutic purposes, serving ends ranging from the frivolous and disquieting to the offensive and pernicious. These powers are available as instruments of bioterrorism, for example, genetically engineered drug-resistant bacteria or drugs to obliterate memory, as agents of social control, for example, drugs to tame rowdies and dissenters, or fertility blockers for welfare recipients, and as means of trying to improve or perfect our bodies and minds and those of our children, for example, genetically engineered supermuscles or drugs to improve memory. Anticipating possible threats to our security, freedom, and even our very humanity, many people are increasingly worried about where biotechnology may be taking us. We are concerned not only about what others may do to us, but also about what we may do to ourselves. We are concerned that our society might be harmed and that we ourselves might be diminished, indeed in ways that could undermine the highest and richest possibilities of human life. Now, most of us cheerfully believe that we can both enjoy the promise and escape the perils of the coming biotechnological age. Most of us also believe that there is little connection between the promise and the peril, or between the humanistic aspirations that fuel the scientific enterprise and the deadly or dehumanizing uses to which new technologies might perversely be put. But a powerful challenge to our complacent opinions is provided by the exhibit in this museum and also by an exhibit prepared by the United States Holocaust Museum, Deadly Medicine, Creating the Master Race. These exhibits document the abominable uses that the Nazis made of science and medicine. But even more relevant for us, they also present the scientific outlook on life and the aspiration to human perfectibility that the Nazis inherited and exploited, an outlook and an aspiration that I'm sorry to say dwell robustly in American cultural life today. So now to the bulk of the argument. Part 1 of 5 is called Science as Salvation, a Cautionary Tale. And I'm going to show some slides from the Washington-based exhibit because I hadn't seen this one before today, but the carryover, I think, will be evident. The Deadly Medicine exhibit actually invites us to self-attention because of where it starts and how it was structured. The first of the exhibit's 3 parts, devoted to pre-Nazi Weimar eugenic ideas and practices, is entitled Science as Salvation. The next 2 parts display first the biological state through which those eugenic ideas were turned into Nazi racial hygiene, 1933 to 1939, and last, the final solution through which Nazi racial hygienic practices became, 1939 to 1945, mass murderous. The exhibit thus locates the Nazi medical atrocities in the company of an idealistic science that preceded it, and it asks us to ponder whether there is any deep connection between the beauty of the glass man, which I will show you in a moment, and the night of the broken glass and the horrors thereafter. The true power of that exhibit, and indeed of certain things in this one, lies in the question that it tacitly poses regarding the relation between the last phase and the first. What, if any, is the connection, not only historical, but also logical, between the final solution and the disposition to look to science for salvation? How, if at all, are the optimistic dreams of building a more perfect human through science and medicine related to the actual building of death camps in which real human beings, deemed worthless and worse, were exterminated like so much vermin? Now, nothing in the exhibit and nothing that I'm going to say should suggest that the idealistic science of Weimar produced or even necessarily led to the final solution, though we do learn that the former sowed the seeds that were later used to grow the murderous fruit. And it is surely not the exhibit's even subliminal intention to suggest that noble science need elsewhere become, however unintentionally, the handmaid of bestiality, or further that genetics or medicine or psychiatry, now as well as then, should come under suspicion of lending strength to deadly inhumanity. Yet, and on the other hand, the exhibit, to its great credit, does not allow us lovers of science and progress to rest comfortably with the belief that the Nazis simply corrupted and perverted science, or that their science wasn't really even science, or that their nefarious purposes were worlds apart from the humanitarian aspirations of modern medicine. The exhibit compels us to consider whether the Nazi use of medical science might have been less a perversion of science, more a monstrously evil yet also logically fitting conclusion from certain dubious premises and attitudes in the scientific outlook itself, and especially from the prevailing assumptions about the role of science in human affairs. Is there perhaps something wrong, even deadly wrong, in seeing science as our salvation? If so, then we might need to be on our guard when this siren song is sung to us, as it is today being sung by an ever larger, louder, and much more competent chorus. Now, to reach the ghastly result, the eugenic and perfectionist vision of Weimar had to be politicized by the Nazis, and in a most particular way. The project for the final solution depended decisively on the presence of a nearly omnicompetent totalitarian and tyrannical state, enforcing state-sponsored racial and ethnic hatreds, and assaulting the traditional teaching, both biblical and liberal democratic, of the irreducible and equal dignity of every human individual. God willing, we shall not see such a regime again. Compassionate people like ourselves, who enjoy the protections of liberal democratic institutions, strong cultural prejudice favoring the individual against the collective, and, however much diminished, the invaluable Judeo-Christian belief in the sanctity of human life, can realistically believe that it cannot happen here. And I surely agree with this conclusion. But, and this is the first important point I wish to make, the explicitly Nazi elements of tyranny and race hatred are not absolutely necessary for producing a deadly medicine, even if it never again becomes a Holocaust. A free people choosing for ourselves can and very likely will produce similar deadly fruit from the same dangerous seeds, unless we are ever vigilant against the dangers. This lecture seeks to identify some of the deadly dangers that lurk in the seductive ideas and practice of science as salvation. The essence of the peril lies, ironically, in the zealous pursuit of the more perfect human. Now, a word of caution against the possible misunderstanding. Although I shall be raising questions about the idea and practice of scientism, the belief that science offers a complete account of everything important in human life and that it should be looked to for our salvation, nothing that I say should be taken as anti-science or anti-scientist or anti-medicine. The question before us is not the goodness of science and medicine as such, but simply the goodness of looking to science and medicine as the solution for the human condition, for the relief and salvation of man's estate. The first two images from the Holocaust Museum, the Washington Holocaust Museum exhibit, pose the problem and set the stage for all my reflections. The glass man, I'm going to show you two pictures, and then the photographs of the survivors of the First World War. The exhibit opens with the stunning glass man first displayed at the German Hygiene Museum in Dresden in 1930. Though many of us become familiar with transparent models of the human body, they are today widely manufactured as science toys for school children, it is difficult to exaggerate the excitement that these original models created. For the first time, the common man could glimpse a lifelike model of his insides, organ by organ, artery by artery, nerve by nerve, seeing with illuminated brilliance all the parts that make him run. Far from looking ashamed or diminished by this anatomizing invasion of his inner being, the glass man stands toweringly over us, fitly and proudly, with arms uplifted in a gesture of triumphant appeal for heavenly applause, a model of human perfection, not to say apotheosis. The next slide shows you the difference between the glass man and the onlookers. Moreover, this perfect man clearly came not from the hand of God, but from an even more perfect human being, the scientific and medical visionary who would someday soon help humankind collectively achieve the healthful perfection here modeled in glass. Make no mistake, this was serious business, for the glass man was willy-nilly the emblem of a new religion. In place of the God who became man, we have here the man become as God. In place, for example, of the suffering Christ, arms stretched in crucifixion, we have the impervious glass man, arms elevated in self-exaltation. And creatively behind the scene, in place of a God who it is said sent his Son who would, through his own suffering, take away the sins of the world, we have the scientific Savior who would take away the sin of suffering altogether. The glass man in loco crucifixus is the perfect icon for salvific science. The dream of perfect health and fitness is, of course, quite ancient. Indeed, 300 years earlier, it acquired an honored place among the goals of modern science, when its great founders, Francis Bacon and René Descartes, summoned humankind to the conquest of nature for the relief of man's estate. Mastery and possession of nature, Descartes announces, quote, is desirable not only for the invention of an infinity of artifices which would enable us to enjoy without any pain the fruits of the earth and all the commodities to be found there, but also and principally for the conservation of health, which is without doubt the primary good and the foundation of all other goods in this life. As the sequel makes clear, Descartes had his eye on goals grander than the mere absence of disease or even just ordinary bodily health. I quote again, "For even the mind is so dependent on the temperament and the disposition of the organs of the body, that if it is possible to find some means that generally render men more wise and more capable than they hitherto have been, I believe that we must seek for it in medicine. We could be spared an infinity of diseases of the body as well as of the mind, and even also perhaps the enfeeblement of old age, if we had enough knowledge of their causes and all the remedies which nature has provided us." Descartes is talking really ultimately about the conquest of mortality itself. But the ancient dream of perfect health and fitness had acquired a new prominence in Europe owing to the Great War, only recently ended. Images from the aftermath of that war, the second display of the exhibit in Washington, provided the counterpart to the glass man and in part explain why he had such great social appeal. Human deformity, from loss of limbs to loss of mind, came home from the war to Germany and to all of Europe by the tens and hundreds of thousands. The maimed and the enfeebled had rarely, if ever, been seen in such numbers, thanks, please note, to the great technological improvements for waging war. And the response of the German mind, humiliated in the war, did not take the most compassionate turn. On the contrary, fear and loathing of the deformed and the defective found abundant expression as hatred of imperfection grew up with and encouraged the desire to imitate the perfection of the glass man. In 1920, right after the war and well before the Nazi period, a distinguished jurist, Karl Bindung, and a distinguished physician, Dr. Albert Hoch, both of them liberals and progressives, published a chilling booklet entitled On Permitting or Authorizing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life, Lebensunwerten Lebens. Beginning modestly with a defense of the moral acceptability of suicide and assisted suicide, Bindung and Hoch moved cunningly to a defense of killing those whose miserable condition of body and mind calls for the healing remedy of premature death from the hand of medical science. Contemplating the battlefield strewn with thousands of dead youths and comparing this with the mental hospitals dedicated to the long-term care of the demented and the mentally ill, Bindung comments, quote, "One will be deeply shaken by the strident clash between the sacrifice of the finest flower of humanity in its full measure on the one side, and by the meticulous care shown to existences which are not just absolutely worthless, but even of negative value on the other." And Dr. Hoch ends his part of the booklet with a paean to the dawning of a new age. I quote, "There was a time, now considered barbaric, in which eliminating those who were born unfit for life or who later became so was taken for granted. Then came the phase, continuing into the present, in which preserving every existence, no matter how worthless, stood as the highest moral value. A new age will arrive, operating with a higher morality and with great sacrifice, which will actually give up the requirements of an exaggerated humanism and overvaluation of mere existence," unquote. A vigorous society comprising only healthy and fit members is more than justified in doing battle with the evils of deformity and disability by cleansing society of the disabled and the deformed themselves. These twin goals, the positive goal of seeking perfection, the negative goal of removing imperfection, are to repeat nothing new. They are of ancient pedigree. Indeed, they inspire much of the good that we do in life, and not only in medicine. We pursue virtue or excellence. We stifle vice and correct mediocrity. We urge our children to be good and our societies to be better. We try to eliminate the deficiencies and evils to which they are subject. For Christians, the counsel of perfection is even a divine injunction. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Though the perfection Jesus had in mind, I am confident, cannot be pictured in glass. To be sure, there is always a danger that we will turn our opposition to deficiency into a rejection of those who bear it. That, for example, the battle against ignorance or impairment will translate into a hatred for the ignorant or the impaired. Indeed, by calling them after their imperfections, he is a paraplegic, she is a Downs, we show our penchant for not distinguishing between the sin and the sinner. But this age-old tendency acquires a new character and a new momentum in an age that not only extols and extorts to perfection, but also, and more important, gathers the scientific means to pursue it. So just as the loathing of imperfection fuels the search for perfection, so the search for perfection makes imperfection all the more intolerable. Such is the inner meaning of science seen as salvation, informed by a new idea of human perfection that has in the end little patience with human frailty and disability. That attitude is once again gaining strength, and this time it comes with first-rate science and powerful and precise technique. And in contrast to pre-World War II Germany, it speaks in the seductive voices of freedom, compassion, and self-improvement. The technologies of interest touch all aspects of human life, from beginning through middle to end. Even as we but stand at the dawn of the new age ushered in by deciphering the entire human genome, we are already widely practicing genetic screening and prenatal and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, capable of identifying and rooting out the genetically unfit before they can be born. And advances in genetics, developmental biology, and neuroscience promise us all sorts of enhancements in human nature that would make us better than well, both in body and in mind. On the negative side, eliminating imperfections, the prime targets for prevention, correction, and elimination are mental retardation and mental illness, severe bodily deformity and disability, and later in life, dementia, debility, and enfeeblement, serious imperfections all. On the positive side, promoting perfection, the prime targets for improvement are memory, muscularity, mood, temperament, intelligence, and the holy grail, human finitude itself, to be ameliorated to the conquest of biological senescence. Time does not permit a proper examination of even one of these promises. Instead, I will take a more synoptic overview, but with some special attention to eugenics. I will briefly review some of the more obvious sources of danger, moral hazards that are especially difficult for us to recognize because our practices appear to be governed not by coercive state policy, but by unconstrained, free human choice. Aiming to present the big picture, the better to awaken us from our complacency, I'm going to paint with broad strokes. Accordingly, the demonstrations I offer are showings appealing to our intuitions, not logical proofs appealing to our analytical reason. The difficulties that you might find with this analysis or pressure on particular points, please raise with me in the question period. On parts 2 and 3 will be devoted sequentially to two sorts of moral hazards: dangerous practices first and dangerous thinking second. Part 2 then, dangerous practices, negative and positive eugenics. And this is now talking about us. In the exciting early days of the genetic revolution, the 1960s and 1970s, both positive and negative eugenic goals were enunciated with great gusto. Conferences were held with the bold titles of Genetics and the Future of Man. At one such meeting, the distinguished molecular biologist Robert Sinsheimer enthused that, quote, "For the first time in all time, a living creature understands its origins and can undertake to design its future. We can be the agent of transition to a wholly new path of evolution," unquote. About the same time, Nobel laureate Joshua Lederberg saw in the prospect of human cloning an end to the rule of chance in human reproduction and the opportunity to perpetuate unaltered the genes of genius. and many people looked forward to discovering whether a second Mozart might outdo the first. About the same time, the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the gentle geneticist Bentley Glass, enunciated a new right, quote, "The right of every child to be born with a sound physical and mental constitution based on a sound genotype," unquote. Looking ahead to the reproductive and genetic technologies that are today rapidly arriving, Glass proclaimed, and I quote again, "No parents will in that future time have a right to burden society with a malformed or mentally incompetent child," unquote. Nowadays, we hear almost no such bold eugenic talk from mainstream scientists, though it is buoyed about the margins by a small group of bioprophets summoning us to a post-human future or a remaking of Eden. But eugenic vision and practice are gaining strength, all the more so because they grow out of sight behind the fig leaf of the doctrine of free choice. We are largely unaware that we have, as a society, already embraced the eugenic principle: defectives shall not be born, because our practices are decentralized and because they operate not by coercion, but by private reproductive choice. Genetic knowledge, we are told, is merely providing information and technique to enable people to make better decisions about their health or reproductive choices. But our existing practices of genetic screening and prenatal diagnosis show that this claim is at best self-deceptive, at worst disingenuous. The choice to develop and practice genetic screening and the choices of which genes to target for testing have been made not by the public, but by scientists, and not on liberty-enhancing, but on eugenic grounds. Many practitioners of prenatal diagnosis refuse to do fetal genetic screening in the absence of a prior commitment from the pregnant woman to abort any afflicted fetus. And many pregnant women who wish not to know prenatal facts must withstand strong medical pressures for testing. Practitioners of prenatal diagnosis working today with but a fraction of information soon to be available from the Human Genome Project already screen for a long list of genetic diseases and abnormalities, from Down syndrome to dwarfism. Possession of any one of these defects, they believe, renders a prospective child unworthy of life. Persons who happen still to be born with these conditions, having somehow escaped the spreading net of detection and eugenic abortion, are increasingly regarded as mistakes, as inferior human beings who should not have been born. Not long ago, at my own university, a physician making rounds with medical students stood over the bed of an intelligent, otherwise normal 10-year-old boy with mild spina bifida. Were he to have been conceived today, the physician casually informed his entourage, he would have been aborted. A woman I know with a child who has Down syndrome is asked by total strangers on the street, "Didn't you have an amnio?" The eugenic mentality is taking root, and we are subtly learning with the help of science to believe that there really are certain lives unworthy of being born. Not surprisingly, in the face of these practical possibilities, prominent intellectuals are now providing justifications for this view of life. The current journals of bioethics, no less, are filled with writings that sweetly sing the song of Bindung and Hoch, albeit without the menacing German accent. But not all are so reticent. Here, for example, are remarks from the writings of Peter Singer, DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton, on the question of killing infants with serious yet manageable diseases such as hemophilia. I quote, when the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects for a happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. The loss of a happy life for the first infant is outweighed by the gain of a happier life for the second, even if not yet born. Therefore, if killing the hemophiliac infant has no adverse effects on others, according to the total view, it would be right to kill him, unquote. In a recent magazine interview, Singer was asked, quote, What about parents conceiving and giving birth to a child specifically to kill him, take his organs, and transplant them into their ill older children? Quote. Singer replied, and I quote, "It is difficult to warm to parents who can take such a detached view, but they are not doing something really wrong in itself," unquote. The interviewer then asked, "Is there anything wrong with a society in which children are bred for spare parts on a massive scale?" The Princeton professor of bioethics replied, "No." Do not underestimate what it means for us that such coolly lethal opinions, regarded since 1945 as barbaric, are today treated again with seriousness, and that proponents of such opinions can occupy professional chairs of ethics at a place like Princeton. Similar ideas and practices are coming into vogue at the other end of life. The practice of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia has been legal in Holland for several decades, and more recently in our own state of Oregon. After several quiet years, the campaign is heating up again, and several state legislatures are once again considering Oregon-like legislation. For a variety of reasons, an age of legalized euthanasia is likely soon to be upon us. Few are going to speak openly, like Peter Singer, about ending worthless lives. But like him, they will promote the deadly practice under the banner of autonomy and choice, graced with slogans of a dignified death, and of course, on the side, utilitarian appeals to cut the costs of care. To be sure, large familial and social difficulties of a mass geriatric society are already upon us, destined to become much more severe as the baby boomers enter upon their seniority and, alas, senility. Although vast numbers of old people are today healthier and longer lived than ever before, the price of many of them are paying for the extra decade of vigorous old age between 70 and 80 is often another decade between 80 and 90 of enfeeblement, debility, and dementia. Today, over 4.5 million Americans are afflicted with Alzheimer's disease, a number predicted to triple before mid-century. Thanks to our ability to treat acute illnesses and crises, roughly 40% of us can expect to spend roughly 10 frail, enfeebled, and often demented years at the end of our lives, incapable of caring for ourselves in a world of fewer and fewer familial caregivers, and in most cases, without resources to purchase decent home or institutional care. Already we hear the dire statistics about the amount of healthcare costs spent futilely on the last 6 months of life. Already we hear calls for rationing, for not wasting resources on persons with low quality of life, which is, after all, a gentle Americanism for the German life unworthy of living. Now, I don't mean for a moment to minimize the ethical anguish that often confronts patients and families when loved ones linger on, their memories gone, their lives little resembling anything like the one they have enjoyed in their prime. But I at least still shudder when I hear the call for a technical, quick solution to the need for long-term care. For I know what we have to fear when a shallow notion of death with dignity enlists deadly medical force to solve society's demographic and economic problems. In Holland, we have seen a foretaste of the future. There, the right to die has flowed down a slippery slope to its most radical meaning, and then some. From first a right to refuse treatment, to a right to control one's own dying, to a right to assistance in becoming dead, to a right to voluntary euthanasia, to a right to be mercifully dispatched by one's doctor should he decide that you are better off dead. The descent into unauthorized euthanasia is confirmed by official reports from Holland, notwithstanding all of their guidelines, with roughly a third of Dutch doctors speaking under immunity, confessing that they have been practicing non-voluntary euthanasia without patient knowledge or consent, including on a significant number of patients who are mentally totally competent. In 2005, without anyone making a fuss, the Dutch issued a protocol for euthanizing severely ill newborns. If this can happen among the liberal and tolerant Dutch, are we so sure that it cannot happen here? But the battle against imperfection by eliminating the imperfect is only part of our current eugenic story. Much more vigorous is our scientific and biotechnical quest for human improvement, for doing nature one better and making a more perfect human being. Embryos that are now screened for the presence of disease-causing genetic abnormalities may also soon be screened for the presence of certain desirable genetic traits, from perfect pitch to greater height to calmer temperament, and perhaps even someday to higher IQ. And although precise genetic engineering of so-called designer babies seems to me to be pure science fiction, human cloning does hold out the prospect of trying to perpetuate tested superior genotypes. Genetic engineering of adults holds out the prospect of enhancing muscle bulk and performance. And beyond genetic enhancement, psychoactive drugs are being developed to increase concentration, to erase troubling memories, or to alter personality. And there is active research to increase the maximum life expectancy, from hormone treatments to stem cell-based transplantable tissues to the ultimate weapon, the control of the genes that determine the rate of aging and the age of death. Finally, there is also active research on human-computer interactions, beginning with attempts to enable the deaf to hear and the blind to see, but issuing perhaps in computer implants in the brain that it would enable us to download entire libraries at the click of a mouse. Now, apart from a few zealots, such as the Immortalists or the bionics boosters around Wired magazine, most people exploring these prospects are not trying to build a Superman or a post-human being. They are, by their own lights, just trying to enhance human performance by these more effective biotechnical means, offering a psychophysical route to human improvement that could supplement and extend the improvements we cultivate for ourselves through education or personal training. Yet, especially with large commercial interests hyping the benefits and creating new demands, there is no question but that such enhancements will be widely desired and used to satisfy the age-old personal human dreams of better children, superior performance, ageless bodies, and happy souls. There may even be enlisted to advance certain social goals, enabling soldiers and pilots to go without sleep, or school teachers and prison wardens to pacify the unruly. We have only begun to consider the momentous ethical and social questions in store for us as we head down this road. A report from the President's Council on Bioethics, Beyond Therapy, Biotechnology and the Pursuit of Happiness is an early effort to articulate our unease at these prospects. And for those of you who are interested, it's available free online at www.bioethics.gov. We are right to be concerned about the meaning of pursuing venerable human goals by these magical technical means, just as we are right to be concerned about the wisdom of trying to transcend through technology the parameters of our given nature, the delicately balanced product of eons of gradual evolution. Will human life really be better if we turn to biotechnology to fulfill our deepest human desires? Will those desires be properly satisfied? Will our enhanced activities really be better and better humanly? There is an old expression, to a man armed with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To a society armed with biotechnology, the activities of human life may come to be seen in purely technical terms and more amenable to improvement than they really are. Worse, like Midas, we may get more easily what we asked for, only to realize that it is vastly less than what we really wanted. Yes, we want better children, but not by turning procreation into manufacture or by altering their brains to give them an edge over their peers. Yes, we want to perform better in the activities of life, but not by becoming mere creatures of our chemists or by turning ourselves into bionic tools designed to win and achieve in inhuman ways. Yes, we want longer lives, but not at the cost of living carelessly or shallowly with diminished aspiration for living well, or becoming people so obsessed with our own longevity that we care little about the next generation. We want to be happy, yes, but not by means of drugs that give us happy feelings without the real loves, attachments, and achievements that are essential for true human flourishing. The pursuit of these perfections, defined scientifically and obtained technologically, not only threatens to make us more intolerant of imperfection, both our own and of our neighbors. It also threatens to sell short the true prospects for human flourishing, which have always been found in love and friendship, work and play, art and science, song and dance, service and worship, not in chemically induced highs or bionic achievements. Our deepest longings are not for artificial contentment and factitious achievements, but for lives that are meaningful, connected, and humanly flourishing. In the absence of knowing what human flourishing is, there can be no perfecting of human beings or enhancement of human life. And no one can presume to judge any change in human nature or human activity to be an improvement, never mind a perfection, if they do not know what is humanly good. Part 3 is called Dangerous Thinking, Soulless Scientism. The question we must therefore put to the human enhancers and the post-human futurists is this: what knowledge of the human good do you have that entitles you to gamble the human future on your hunches that these proposed alterations will in fact make us better or happier? It is a question that science and technology simply cannot answer, and worse, that our bioprophets do not even think to ask. No danger we face in the coming age of biotechnology is greater than the danger of careless and shallow thinking. If we are to avoid both the deadly and dehumanizing results from our uses of biotechnology, we'll need to be vigilant in our practices and resourceful in our thinking. Everything will depend on whether the technological disposition is allowed to proceed to its self-augmenting limits, or whether it can be restricted and brought under intellectual, spiritual, moral, and political rule. But on this front, I regret to say, the news is not encouraging. For the relevant intellectual, spiritual, and moral resources of our society, the legacy of civilizing traditions painfully acquired and long preserved are taking a beating, not least because they are being called into question by the findings of modern science itself. The technologies indeed present troublesome ethical questions, but the underlying scientific notions, so we are told, call into question the very foundation of our ethics and our human self-understanding. In the 19th and early 20th century, the challenge came in the form of Darwinism and its seeming opposition to biblical religion, a battle initiated not so much by scientists as by the beleaguered defendants of orthodoxy. In our own time, the challenge comes from molecular biology, behavioral genetics, neuroscience, and evolutionary psychology, fueled by their practitioners' overconfident belief in the sufficiency of their reductionistic explanation of all vital and human phenomena, and in some cases by explicit intention to overthrow our venerable religious beliefs. Never mind created in the image of God. What elevated humanistic view of human life or human goodness is defensible against the belief, trumpeted today by biology's most public and prophetic voices, that man is just a collection of molecules, an accident on the stage of evolution, a freakish speck of mind in the mindless universe, fundamentally no different from other living or even non-living things? What chance have our treasured ideas of freedom and dignity against the reductive notion of the selfish gene, or for that matter, of genes for altruism, or the belief that DNA is the essence of life, or the teaching that all human behavior and our rich inner life are rendered intelligible only in terms of neurochemicals or their contributions to species survival and reproductive success? These transformations of our moral outlook are in fact welcomed by many of our leading scientists and intellectuals. 10 years ago, the luminaries of the International Academy of Humanism, including biologists Francis Crick, Richard Dawkins, and E.O. Wilson, as well as the humanists Isaiah Berlin, W.V. Quine, and Kurt Vonnegut, issued a statement defending human cloning in higher mammals and human beings. Listen to their reasons. I quote, "What moral issues would human cloning raise? Some world religions teach that human beings are fundamentally different from other mammals, that humans have been imbued by a deity with immortal souls, giving them a value that cannot be compared to that of other living things. Human nature is held to be unique and sacred. But as far as the scientific enterprise can determine, humanity's rich repertoire of thoughts, feelings, aspirations, and hopes seem to arise from electrochemical brain processes, not from an immaterial soul that operates in ways no instrument can discover. Views of human nature rooted in humanity's tribal past ought not to be our primary criterion for making moral decisions about cloning. It would be a tragedy if ancient theological scruples should lead to a Luddite rejection of cloning, end of quote. There is, of course, nothing novel about reductionism and materialism of the kind displayed here. These are doctrines with which Socrates contended long ago. What is new is that as philosophies, they seem to many people to be vindicated by scientific advance. Here, in consequence, is perhaps the most pernicious result of our technological progress, more dehumanizing than any actual manipulation or technique, present or future. The erosion, perhaps the final erosion, of the idea of man as something noble, dignified, precious, or godlike, and its replacement with a view of man no less than of nature as mere raw material for manipulation and homogenization according to our fancies and will. This is our peculiar moral crisis. We are in turbulent seas without a landmark precisely because we adhere more and more to a scientific view of nature and of human life that on the one hand gives us enormous power, and that at the same time and on the other hand denies every possibility of non-arbitrary standards for guiding its use. Though well-equipped, we know not who we are nor where we are going. We triumph over nature's unpredictabilities only to subject ourselves tragically to the still greater unpredictability of our capricious wills and our fickle opinions. Engineering the engineer as well as his engine, we race our train, we know not where. Lacking any rich view of human flourishing, our pursuit of a more perfect human is at best chimerical. That we do not recognize our predicament is itself a tribute to the depth of our infatuation with scientific progress and our naive faith in the sufficiency of our humanitarian impulses. Let me return in conclusion to look once again at the glass man, seen now in the light of this discussion. It turns out that the glass man is in fact not transparent, but opaque. It pretends to show us the innermost man, but in truth renders his humanity permanently absent. Yes, we see the liver, the kidneys, and the colon, but we learn nothing about the soul. The mysterious character of the human person has not been explained. Rather, it has been ignored, nay, banished. The problem is not that anatomizing did not reveal the soul. No one thought it could. It is rather that anatomizing ignores and then denies the soul, denies the wholeness and the inner depth of the human being, even in the very act that seems for the first time to make it visible to him. In one respect, however, the glass man reveals a permanent truth about the human being, ironically driving home a lesson that I do not believe that its makers meant to teach. When we look at the glass man's head and face, and I'm sorry the image is not as good as it should be, hoping to find evidence of the human soul within, what stares back at us is only the bony skull, universally the mark and symbol of death. Lurking beneath the outer surface of the godlike man is the truth about his vaunted perfection. Alas, poor Yorick, death will be his fate, medicine or no medicine. And surely speaking better than his creators intended, the glass man's skull that beckons death for the individual human being betokens also the deadly consequences for a society that would pursue bodily perfection in ways that do not also join hands in solidarity with those who will never reach it. The idealistic German scientists could not have known that the glass man was the harbinger of anything like the final solution. But they should have known that the biologizing and soulless account of human life that they were trumpeting is in fact always deadly to humanity, even if not one crematorium is built. A dehumanizing account of human life can all by itself produce a holocaust of the human spirit. To keep human life human, we need first and foremost a more natural biology and anthropology, a robust account of the nature and meaning of our own humanity that will do justice to life as lived, with its high aspirations, deep longings, and rich possibilities for flourishing. In seeking such an account, we must draw on the wisdom of poets and philosophers and the insights of the great religious traditions. But one thing is clear: our penchant to think only in terms of the American ideals of freedom and equality will not be equal to the task. In addition, we will need a robust account of human dignity, of our peculiarly human special standing, one that has been variously captured in notions that describe us as the rational animal, or made in the image of God, or higher than the beasts, lower than the angels. Faced with the twin dangers of death on the one hand and dehumanization on the other, it will be important to advance an account of human dignity that does justice both to the equal dignity we all share by virtue of our common humanity, and the dignity to which we all can aspire by exercising our humanity to the greatest and finest extents possible. Neither the dignity of equal humanity nor the dignity of human excellence is imageable in the man of glass. There is no question that modern science is one of the truly great monuments to the human intellect. Precisely because it is value neutral and heuristically materialist, it gains the kind of knowledge of how our bodies work that is tremendously helpful in ameliorating disease and relieving suffering. But it cannot even come within hailing distance of human perfection, let alone salvation. In seeking our salvation, if salvation is to be sought, we must continue to look beyond ourselves and honor the longings of our souls, while humbly trusting our limited powers and still more limited wisdom to try to make our world a little bit better rather than a little bit worse. In the end, the good that we will do with science and medicine can only be completed by avoiding those evils that come from seeing health as salvation, the soul as biochemicals, and medicine as the Messiah. Thank you very much.